No, I think that might have stopped my sharing, has it not?
No, we can still see you.
Okay. Yeah, so, and really just two out of three areas I wanted to cover, the technical areas, what's it going to cost? How much can we make of this stuff called electricity? And what cost will it cost us to do that? Financial is combining the two. So we can look at the costs, we can look at the revenue, we can look at the risks associated with both those streams, those cash flows, and what are the risks on the cost side, what are the risks on the revenue side, and therefore just how much return do we think we can make out of this project? Because we need to make a return. This is not a charity. We've got to make a return on these projects, financial return, so we can do two things. One is pay back any investors, the members of our scheme, but also, of course, create some surplus. So we can then apply that surplus to good causes, helping with fuel poverty, putting it back into other renewables, whatever each of the individual cooperatives or community groups want to do with it. So today is very much about electricity generation, and it's very much about solar panels, but there are other ways that we can do things. Clearly there's wind, and it's great to see onshore wind beginning to make a resurgence in England. It never went away in the rest of the United Kingdom. There's obviously tide, river, anaerobic digestion. There's also battery storage. There's also renewable heat and heat networks. But today, to keep it simple, let's just focus on solar PV on roofs and in fields, and just look at technical and financial aspects. We can talk about legal aspects on another time. So that's really what I wanted to cover. If we wanted to take the key takeaways, it's all about site identification. That's where it all starts. Google is a great piece of technology, actually. Don't underestimate it as a way of finding sites. There's some better technology coming along. There's something called LiDAR, which is a much more accurate way of assessing a building, but we could perhaps talk about that later on. Simple rule of thumb, it's really about what is the roof like, what is the load, and by the load I mean how much electricity is being used at the site or nearby the site. How good is the grid, the electricity grid, to connect you up to the rest of the world? And the other one is it's about also planning, and planning risks can be quite substantial, and understanding what the planners are looking for can be quite important, particularly on ground mounts, not so much on roofs, but certainly on ground mounts. You can go a long way in getting a community energy project off the ground without huge amounts of skill and experience, because that skill and experience will come in time, but equally importantly, that skill and experience is around. CES have got their mentors, which is great, and a couple of those are on this call, and that skills, the real skills and experience you need at the back end of a project can be brought in. You need to have a couple of sites, but once you've got those couple of sites, you need to get help. You need to get help to actually develop them. Funding is available, and Ollie has already pointed to one source. There is something called RCEF. I'm not quite sure the status of RCEF at the moment, or whether that's going to be continued. That's a Rural Community Energy Fund. But it does get technical, and it does get technical quite quickly. And then when you get into a real project and you're really going to start developing it and going to ask for people's money, then it does need to be very carefully thought about in terms of the financing, the design, and the risks. So that's the key things I wanted to cover in the next half an hour or 25 minutes as we've got left. So just very briefly, Basingstoke Energy Co-op, we have been around for 10 years as a cooperative. We're owned by our members. 10 years of designing and installing renewable energy systems, mainly solar PV, mainly on rooftops. So we've done ground mounts, we've done anaerobic digestion, wind, a whole host of other things. After 10 years of doing this, I suppose there is a slight danger. We're beginning to know what we're talking about, but only just.
Martin, I'm just going to interrupt you for a moment, because people are saying they can only see your final slide.
No. I wonder why that is.
I don't know. Everybody.
Well, should I stop and start again?
Oh, I've got it.
Maybe Martin, try and put it on presentation.
Does that work now?
That's beautiful.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Oh, you didn't. Okay, so quickly, well, you haven't missed anything. Most of those slides I was talking to were only words on them anyway. So we, Basingstoke Energy Co-op, and I've talked about those words. And we've been around, as I said, for 10 years. doing community energy. Not only community energy, we do also work in the commercial space and the domestic space as well. And these are the sorts of people we've worked for in the community energy side. These are the sorts of things we've done in terms of big rooftops on schools, in fields, next to railways. I'm sure Ollie one day would take us all through riding sunbeams. That's a great project, but not for today. Here's another one, Made Energy, and I think a couple of the directors of Made Energy are on this call. As an energy co-op, we've helped Made Energy as a community energy group install 3 quite reasonably sized solar panel systems, local schools and an athletic centre and a leisure centre. So these are the sorts of things we do. So what is that journey that we need to go through? Talking now about a site. It's relatively sort of I suppose sequential. First thing, let's start to identify the potential sites in and around our district. What are we actually looking for? So we've got a long list of all the potential sites. As I say, Google is a great way of developing that. So is local knowledge. Where are the local schools? Where are the local warehouses, etc. Try to get that down to a short list, and we'll talk through how we might do that and start to do some pre-qualification. Then it starts getting real when we start having conversations with the owner, because without the permission from the owner, and that could be the freeholder and the leaseholder and several layers of leaseholders after that, then the project really won't get started. And after that, it's looking for some sort of early commitment from the site owner. And that could be as simple as a very simple letter of intent, not particularly legally binding, but just where the owner says, yes, we are interested in developing this site potentially as a community energy project. Once that's in place, we can then begin to look for an indicative business case. What are the costs? What are the revenues? Then we can start thinking about applying for grant funding or other forms of funding. And that's where it does begin to get far more complex. Once you've got to that stage of a couple of sites, agreement from the landowner or the roof owner, that's when you need a perhaps more deep experience and skills in planning, in connecting to the grid, in designing the system, getting the money in place, and of course the legal agreements that you need. But today, I think we just wanted to start with the start of that chain and begin to dip into some of those more detailed technical issues. So let's start with, as it says here, I don't know if you remember Mrs. Beasley, and she developed a cooking book in the early 18th century, and she said, this is how to make a rabbit pie. First catch your rabbit. And I think this is exactly the same with any solar PV development. We've got to start with finding a site. So these are the sorts of factors we should start to begin to think about when looking for a site, either through Google, either through local knowledge. Some of it's some of it is complex, some of it's very easy. Now, the very first things we need to look at in the roof is in which direction does it face and how steeply pitched is it. Ideal roofs are relatively steeply pitched and point to the south, but that doesn't mean it's the only roofs we need. We can work with east and west facing roofs, particularly if they tend to be a little bit flatter. Because the further from the south you are, the flatter the better, actually, and we'll go into that a little bit better later on. Clearly, something that faces to the north, it's not going to really work. But so the first step is, what sort of roof is it? Which direction does it face? What pitch is the roof? How big is it? It's clearly important. It's got to be of a minimum size, otherwise it's not really going to be worth it. The age and the condition of the roof is vitally important. If it's a very old roof and it's going to be replaced in the next 5 to 10 years, well, today is not the time to put solar panels on it, because you're going to have to be taking them off in 5 to 10 years time. But it's one to note, because an ideal time to put solar on a roof is when the roof is being replaced. So, and the condition of the roof as well. I mean, if it's got asbestos, that's always a problem. The ideal roof, though, is the metal trapezoidal roofs. So those are the sorts of things you see on warehouses. And they are ideal because they're very cheap to put solar panels on. You can lay out the panels incredibly quickly on a trapezoidal roof. The electrical submains within the building is also an issue, because what you need to do is get the power off the roof and then be able to feed it into the distribution system of the building. You won't be able to do that from Google, but you can begin to look at that once you've got into a sort of more short list. The load is really, well, how much electricity is going to be used within the building itself. And that's quite a critical factor, because that's the most valuable form of electricity that you can have. If you can feed the electricity being generated on the roof to the building itself, that has the ability to reduce the power purchases of the occupier. And so basically 2 things happen to electricity when it's generated on a roof. It can either be used within the building and save that amount of electricity from being brought from the grid, or it can be exported back to the grid. But to give you a feel for the different values of that electricity that goes back to the grid is worth 5 or 6p a kilowatt hour. That's all you'll generate from it. Electricity that's used on site can be worth up to 30p a kilowatt hour or more, because that's the savings that people will get from not having to buy from the grid. So the amount that's used on site is the real valuable electricity. And as a rule of thumb, but it's only a rule of thumb, if you can get 60 to 70% of the generation being used on site or very nearby, then that starts to make it look like a viable project. Availability is obvious. If it's not available, the landlord or the freeholder doesn't want to do it, then there's no point. Shading is an issue. There's a huge amount of shade, or there's other plant on the room, air conditioning, etc. Is always an issue. Safety, how do you get to site? Is it easy to get off the site? Or also considerations. Confidence and charges, when you get into a little bit more detail, very often if there's a mortgage on the building, there may be some issues, but that's when you get into some of the legal stuff. And that's mainly for that on the left-hand side is the sort of stuff you'll be looking at for a rooftop. Now, on the right-hand side, it gets a little bit more complicated when you are beginning to look at ground mounts. These are the ones in fields, because there are other considerations that need to be taken into account. Land classification grade is important. It's very difficult to get planning permission on very good agricultural land. And indeed, I'd argue you really shouldn't be using that land to put solar panels on. There's plenty of lower grade land that we should be looking at. Does it have any other potential use? If a farm or a field has been zoned for housing, it's no point trying to persuade the owner to put solar panels on there. They would turn it into houses. Nearby housing is an issue as well, because that's very often where some of the objections come from. So if it's in the middle of a town, it's not going to work, but if it's remote, it will do. Rights of way, again, particularly if they are big national paths, can cause a problem. Flood risk and drainage is something that needs to be looked at. This is a site that's in a river valley that's going to flood often. It's not going to be, potentially not going to be suitable for solar PV. Way leaves are just looking at what goes across the site. These are underground grass pipes, underground telecoms, are there power grids on the site, which all add complications to getting planning permission and indeed doing the construction work on the site. And of course, planning constraints. These are around heritages. You're not going to put a solar farm next to Stonehenge, and you shouldn't do. But you've got to look at some of the ecological issues. Shouldn't be on a site of an SSSI, for instance. Very difficult and probably unwise to look at solar farms in areas of outstanding natural beauty or national parks. Doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means there is a lot more work to be done to persuade the planners it's the right thing to do. In terms of costs, well, these are the sorts of costs you might expect for the various sizes of solar PV. Now the costs change, and in fact, over the last 3 months, costs have probably gone up because of the availability of solar panels in the main. But these are the broad prices you should start to think about in terms of solar PV. And as you can see, and if you do the maths, the bigger the better, and the more the metal roofs are better than the tiled roofs. So those are the sorts of things to bear in mind. But the ideal roof is on a big warehouse which has a lot of load underneath it, pointing south, which is relatively new, and there's lots of potential other users in and around the site. But it doesn't mean that's the only sort of thing we should be looking at, but those are the sorts of things to start with. So if we move on to the next one. And then if we start now, once we've now got our short list of lot sites, what are the other things we need to start to consider? Well, these are the key factors in terms of making it worthwhile from a financial point of view. because clearly, as I said, you do have to make a surplus on these projects, because you've got to be able to pay back people, and you've got to be able to do the good stuff that we're all trying to do. The fundamental things are these: the installation cost, how much does it cost to put the solar panels on the roof? The yield, which is where it gets a little bit more technical, is how many kilowatt hours of electricity can be generated from that installation. And as I said, how much will be used on site? And then how are you going to sell the electricity, and to whom? Do you sell it to the roof owner, which is ideal? Do you sell it to a neighbour, which is good, but not quite as good? Or do you sell it back to the grid, which is the worst case? And it actually, even today, it's a little bit difficult for community projects to make them worthwhile purely on sales back to the grid. The costs, well, they're really the cost of construction, but that's not the only thing. You've got to think about the cost of operating and maintenance of the system over, say, 25, 35 or 40 years. The cost of renting the land and the roof, that may be an element. The cost of running a community benefits scheme. And of course, don't forget things like taxes, returns to shareholders, and debt interest. They're all the sorts of things that need to be included in the financial assessment of a particular opportunity. Yield is absolutely important. It is how much electricity is expected, and I've highlighted the word expected to be generated, because you don't know how much electricity will generate until you've actually put it there. You can do modelling, you can do simulation, but you also have to begin to work out how that expectation will change over time. Panels degrade, so you won't get so much electricity from a system in year 10 as you would in year 1, and by year 25 you may only have 80%, and again that needs to be factored in. Revenues are fundamentally driven by the yield and the price you can get from what you make. As I've said, sell it to the roof owner if you can, and having an agreement with the roof owner, and that's something called a power purchase agreement, is absolutely vital, which gives you some degree of certainty of what the revenues you might get for the next 5 years or 10 years. Now, ideally, if you get a power purchase agreement with a roof owner that lasts for the entire project, that's brilliant, but I haven't seen any of those. Others may have done, but to get long-term power purchase agreements are not that easy, but the longer the better. Excuse me. And of course, all of those things change over time. And that leads to a degree of uncertainty and a degree of risk. Some of those factors are more uncertain and risky than others. And so we need to begin to understand those risks. And this is where you need to start. If it's a bigger project, you need to understand what those risks are, particularly if you're going out to raise significant amounts of money on the backs of these projects. This is quite a complex risk analysis we did for one particular project. It was a big project. It was 5 megawatts. So we're talking about something like a £2.5 to £3 million worth of investment. If you're only putting some panels on the school roof, clearly you won't need to go to this sort of depth. But that looks at the risks over time, looking at the likelihood of the risk and the impact of that risk. And the critical ones are the pre-construction risks, the risks you take before you've actually completed the development, and then the post-construction risks are the operational risks. And broadly, the bigger ones are these things here: the load and the offtake. How much can you sell the electricity for, and to whom? Always a risk, but those risks can be mitigated. Pre-construction, the risks are lower, and really around planning and connection. Planning being getting planning permission for it. Which is always, you can never be certain. And the connection is being able to connect it to the grid, which you always have to do regardless of what you want to do with the electricity. It has to have a grid connection, well, in 99.9% of the time. And getting those grid connections can be quite difficult, can be quite lengthy, and on occasions can be quite costly. So again, that's a pre-construction risk. But all of this can be managed. You can manage all of them and mitigate all of them with various contracts, with various, with good design and getting good advice right from the offset. The other issue there is inflation. Be very wary of business plans that look out for 25 years and assume very high inflation rates. Now, we are in a period of high inflation at the moment, but will that continue for 25, 30, 40 years? And inflation can have a big impact on your cash flow analysis. So don't assume it's inflation that's going to deliver the revenues you're looking for. It just needs to be understood, that's all. that's sort of a very quick potted history, and I know we're getting close to the end of what I wanted to say. So here's a couple of examples that we've done very recently. This is a 80 kilowatt, 103 kilowatt installation on a community farm. 103 kilowatts. It uses 70% of all that electricity will be used on site. Cost about 65p a watt to construct. And actually, this was 2 years ago when electricity prices were a third of what they are today. The expected rate of return on that particular investment was 10%. Now, if I were to do the cash flow analysis on that today, I would expect that return to more than doubled. And that's because electricity prices have gone up massively since then. And the modelling, as it says in the graph here, it's a break even of around about year 7 or 8. Now, again, if we were to do the analysis today, because of the high electricity prices, that break even period now might be year 5 or 6. Indeed, that then the entire amount of cash coming from the system would be significantly higher. And of course, costs haven't increased that much. So there's a very good example. Here's another example of an organic farm, actually not far from where I am today. This is a project that might go ahead, but again, it's a great opportunity for a community if it could be community invested. This is a large organic farm. It's a food post-processing factory. 300 kilowatts can go onto that roof, which is 700 odd panels. And you can begin to see also the impact here, which I wanted to demonstrate, that both the roofs point east and west. So they're not, apart from this one here, which is southerly, these two are east and west facing. Indeed, this roof here has some northwest aspect. But this site, sorry, northeastern aspect, this site still is very viable. Because the roofs are relatively flat, these are the relative yields you could get from and compared with a absolutely perfect roof. The southerly roof gets 88% relative yield, i.e. it's 88% of what it would be had it been if it was a perfect roof. But look at the north and the east and west facing roofs. Because they're relatively flat, they still generate a reasonably good yield. 86% on this one with a more southeasterly aspect, but even the one with a southwesterly aspect, but even the one with a northeasterly aspect is still generating 83% of what an ideal roof would generate. Now, again, on this particular project, it was a trapezoidal roof, 6 degrees pitch. Because it's trapezoidal, it means it's relatively cheap to put this system on. The access to that site was very good because it's a manufacturing site. This is the electricity consumption of the site over a 24-hour period, which you can see is very high. It sort of peaks at around 200 kilowatts, but it's pretty flat. So it means that almost all of the electricity that will be generated from that roof will be used within the site, which again drives up the return quite significantly. And these are so when you combine that into a financial analysis, this is the sorts of numbers you would get. It would cost about £170,000. It would yield about 274 megawatt hours of electricity, which is a considerable amount. As you can see, the on-site usage of this particular one was 99%. Almost everything that was consumed, generated off that roof would go to be used on the site. Therefore, the returns would be extremely good. In terms of other things to pick out of there, it's something called the internal rate of return, which is broadly the return, the financial return on that project, which is what the banks and the financiers and anyone lending money to you will look at. In this particular instance, and again, this was last year, this particular one, was 12.7%, which is not bad return on what is effectively a relatively risk-free investment, particularly when you think where interest rates at that time were more like 0.5%. Again, if I looked at this project today with current electricity prices, that would have been more than doubled, which would say that we're pushing something like a 25% return on that rooftop solar. So I think if anyone's telling you that solar doesn't make money now, there's no feed-in tariffs, I think the response is solar on the right roofs in the right location can still make a considerable return for the community. And indeed, for any commercial operators that want to do it as well. So there's plenty of opportunity there. Then the next few slides are when we're beginning to look at very complex developments. And this particular one was looking at a development down in the south of England where it was potentially going to be something like 2.5 megawatts. In that case, we went into far more detail in understanding the technical issues, understanding the yields, understanding the risks and the returns. And I don't really think we want to go through that today because we're trying to just do sort of a version, a 101 type version of the masterclass, keeping it at a relatively high level. But if we wanted to go into detail, if perhaps we want to do this in another session with more detail, these are the sorts of analysis that will need to be done to understand the technical issues and understand the financial issues. So in this particular opportunity, as I say, there was a number of different fields that could be used, which we've got there, looking at a number of different options that were modelled, looking at the impact of the number of options on the amount of the electricity generated that would be consumed within the site, which is what it says on the right-hand side. And as the sites get bigger, the amount of electricity consumed on site drops. Looking at the difference between the yield of the solar PV, which is pretty standard here. This is the yields you would get from the PV during the summer. This is the average load or consumption within the site. So you can see making it too big means there's a waste of electricity. But these are the sorts of things that might be done once you've got a site and once you're actually starting to beginning to think about raising the money. It's not the sort of analysis you need to do from day one. Then, of course, we went on to do a lot more modelling, looking at the different options, then looking at the different risk profiles and looking at the individual costs. But again, that's something done when we have a project and we're out to look for the financing. So this is downstream, if you like. As I say, we could go through these perhaps in another session, but it looks at the sort of the detail that you need to do to begin to understand the operational costs, the operational risks, and the initial costs and the revenues. And in this particular case, we went into quite some detail. The other critical thing that was done, and over this particular case, 25 years, is to begin to look at some scenarios. Now, again, this is a big opportunity, 2.5 megawatts. So we looked at different scenarios and how that would impact on revenues and returns. And it would need to be done if you're into a complex project. The banking case looks at higher, let's assume that the costs are higher than we think they're going to be and the revenues are going to be lower. These are the sorts of cash flows that a bank would look at before investing or lending to the project. Then we just looked at a zero inflation case. What would happen if inflation was lower than we thought it was going to be? We looked at a low price scenario, i.e. what would happen if the prices we sold the electricity at were lower than we thought they'd be. And of course, the base case is the one we think we were working on. And you can begin to see the impact of internal rate of return down here. You take the worst case, it's still 4.5%, 4.6%. But as we go through the different scenarios, we can begin to look at the different internal rates of return. And indeed, the total dividends, in this case, the total dividends, meaning the amount of money the amount of cash that would be generated by the investment, which will be available to the community energy group to either pay back to its members or to invest in other renewable projects or to do whatever it wants to do with the money. So it gives you a feel for does the opportunity make good returns, and what are the risks of those returns not actually occurring. So that was where we start to do that scenario analysis. But that's where I wanted to stop, because we could go deeper and deeper into each one of these areas in terms of the technical design, the simulation of the yields, risk analysis and financial engineering. But I think that's probably going too far for today. But just so hopefully you're now beginning to get a sense of the sorts of things that have to be done. And I don't want to put anyone off, because actually we can go a very long way to getting to sites with that little bit of knowledge, and hopefully some of that knowledge has come across today. So just to recap of where I started, really, we start with the site. We can use software to help us pre-identify and shortlist sites. There's some basic rules of thumb. Look at the roof, try to understand how much electricity is used on site. Is the grid nearby? What are the planning aspects likely to be? It doesn't take a huge amount of skill and experience to get to a relatively good short list of sites just by using Google, just by using local knowledge, just by understanding some of those criteria we just talked about. But once you have got potential sites, then I think it's where a community energy group needs to start bringing in advisors. And as I say, CES can help. The CES has its mentors. There's funding available to get those advisors. But once you have a site and you're working with it and the landlord or the site owner is on side, it does get quite technical quite quickly, as I think we might have seen in some of the later slides. And the financing and design can be quite complex, but it's something that community groups can do, and it's something that community groups have done and have done very successfully. And so it's nothing really stopping us doing it. So really, I think the thing to do now is to go out and look for potential roofs, potential fields in the areas you live and work in, and try to find those sites. I think we might have, I don't know if Liz might tell me I've run over by 5 minutes and therefore we don't have any time for questions, but if Liz says I do, I'm happy to take a few. If not, we can move on.
I think we should do a couple of questions. We're quite flexible on time in these sessions. And we've got two. Actually, first of all, I just want to say thank you. I found that really interesting when I was able to pay attention. There were lots of other things going on. There are a few questions, and I think the last comment, which is it looks very complicated, but a great place to start, coupled with some of the questions, demonstrates the huge range of experience that of people that have come to this session. So we've got a question from Tom Broughton about the degrees of roof. So Tom, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? Then we've got a question from Chris Gray about storage, which might be opening up a whole new series of questions, and a couple of questions. One from Danny Lee about LiDAR. Rodney from MEPM. So I'm just going to hand over to Tom for your question first.
With a low pitched roof, is cleaning more of an issue? If there is a higher pitched roof, then it will be self-cleaning more readily.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Tom. Yeah, it is. They're up to about 10 to 15, over 10 to 15 degrees. Most panels will self-clean quite nicely. If we get those low pitch roofs, it's important to design in walkways. And what we always do is design a walkway in between and you might have seen it in that organic farm I showed you. Rather than plaster the roof with panels, it's best to use those designing walkways where people can then have access to the panels and clean them. And we always say to people, the best time to clean the roof is when you begin to see the yield dropping off below predicted levels. And then it is time to get on the roof and clean them. And so they will need cleaning. And we've seen, but we're talking about maybe 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. It depends. I mean, if you're in a very dusty environment, they will need cleaning more often. If you're near the sea, they will need cleaning more often because you get salt on them. But yeah, it's watching them and then building them in. It costs money, but it's not hugely expensive. I mean, the biggest cost is safe access to the roof. But once you're on the roof, actually with a hose pipe and a soft brush, they can be cleaned relatively rapidly. Yeah.
Rodney, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So, what's the significance of LiDAR? Light-based distance and ranging.
That's exactly what actually laser, I think, the help stands for. But yeah, it depends who you are. But Google's great. But very often it's two-dimensional, and even when it's three-dimensional, it's not brilliant. LiDAR gives you much more information about the orientation, the pitch of the roof, the type of roof, than any obstructions on the roof. But it's also beginning to be matched with solar irradiance databases. So not only can it tell you what the roof looks like and what its pitch and orientation is, it will make a sort of first good guess at how much solar generation there will be from that roof. So it's a combination of LiDAR and those pieces of software. And we're working with some guys down in Southampton University, actually, I'm working with who are doing exactly that. And they're coming up with some really smart stuff where they can use the LiDAR, which comes off satellites or aeroplanes data, combine that with solar irradiance databases, and have a very good first guess at the amount of yield you can get from a roof. And as I say, that's beginning to develop. It's relatively new. I mean, Google are doing it in the United States, actually. But that will help in identifying roofs and making the whole process a lot quicker, because a lot of the donkey work is being done by the technology.
Yeah, it's good to see space technology being used for terrestrial applications.
Indeed, yeah. As I say, some of it's based on aeroplanes flying around as well. But
yeah, okay. Aerospace.
Keep your eye on it, and if anyone's interested, I'll introduce you to the guys at the University of Southampton are doing it.
We've got a question from David Saunders and also one from Roger, which are kind of the same thing. David has asked if we can sell to neighbours, and Roger has asked if there's any progress on peer-to-peer trading. This might be getting into quite weighty policy questions here, but Martin, are you able to address either of those, or Michael perhaps?
Yeah, I quickly, and Michael or Nicola might have a view as well. I mean, yeah, the peer-to-peer trading is beginning to emerge. There's something called energy local as a model, where you can actually sell electricity to the local neighbourhood using a slight quirk in the current legislation. But there's a new bill going through Parliament which tries to make that a lot easier. Which is one way of doing it, which allows you to get your electricity out to the wider network. There is a couple of other ways. One is a private wire, which means if you're not going across public land, you're staying within the same estate, you can actually connect up different systems through a private wire arrangement. There's something called power purchase agreements, is where you can sell the electricity to a broker who will then sell it on to neighborhoods. So there are different ways of doing it. As I say, the ideal way is to sell it to someone who is underneath the roof. But then the further away you go, fundamentally, the less money you'll be making, because you have to pay someone else to take the electricity for you, either through a private wire, through energy local, or through things like power purchase agreements, or something called sleeving as well, which can work. But again, it gets quite complex when you get into that. And I would say, but I could be wrong, that for community energy groups, it may be best to start with the simple ones and don't get into sleeving and complex PPAs just yet.
Thank you, Martin. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to put the storage question on hold for a bit, and I'm going to open the breakout rooms. I think you will get allocated automatically. If you really want to change and join a different breakout room, just come back to the main room and I can reallocate you. So just bear with me while I open the breakout rooms.
Yeah.
You have 15
and let
minutes.
me just quickly explain what we're going to do. What we've
do.
done is just 4 sites in and around Basingstoke, because I happen to know them, where each breakout group can talk about that site and begin to think, is this site worthwhile or not? What's the pros, what's the cons? And there are 4 sites. I think, as Liz says, we're all going to be randomly assigned to one of them. So you'll either be looking at a big local warehouse, which is run by a local supermarket and use chilled and frozen food with a 10-degree roof. There's a local secondary school with some big tiled roofs with those sorts of pitches. There's an open field, so we can look at that one. And then there's a farm with a general storage shed and an animal farm. So we can look at those, have a sort of a 10 to 15 minute chat, maybe 10 minutes now, so we can keep the time, and then come back and have a quick discussion about what do we think about those sites.
Okay, great. And I've uploaded your presentation so people can download it from the chat box in case they want to refer back to it for their discussions.
Okay.
So you should be able to find the presentation a little further back in the chat box, everyone.
And the very last slide gives a little bit more detail of each of those, where they are, and a picture. Okay. So, well, we've got how long have we got, Liz, to do that? Because
you've got 15 minutes, but it looks like people are not being assigned automatically. So I'm going to have to assign people, which is quite annoying. Are you able to assign yourselves people? No one's answering.
How do I do that? How do I assign myself?
I'm not sure. Well, I can't tell from where I am, so I'm just going to assign people, and let me know if you want to move once you've been sent somewhere.
If you go down to the bottom key along the bottom, there's a icon on the right with a square with 4 little squares. If you click on that and then scale down, then you can join a one of the groups.
If that's, I think I'm assigning a few people in there as well randomly.
Thank you.
Martin, I don't have your slides here. I know it's in the chat box, but I can't find the link, so I can get that up in my group.
Hang on, I'll upload it again into the chat box. Hang on. Okay, it's uploading.
Thanks. Yeah, got it.
Right, let me just keep assigning people.
Oh, remote field, we need more people in the remote field.
Right.
I'm going to go into warehouse roofs because I'd love to see David Saunders.
Oh, is it not? Oh, there are lots of people in remote fields.
Oh, there. Go on then.
Yeah.
Right, so we just go to each of our rooms, do we? And then
Yes.
we have
You're
a
in
little chat.
remote field, aren't you?
I think so.
I've assigned
Okay.
you. Okay.
Sent through the diary that had a join thing.
Let me just mute myself. Okay. Welcome back, Roger. Hang on, let me just shut the door.
Hi. Yeah, this one went into the wrong chat, I think.
Oh, I have just recorded. Sorry, you went into the wrong chats, did you say?
Oh, no, sorry, I was talking to myself. Yeah, no, I posted a comment to the chat and it went into the breakout room.
Ah, well, put it back in here.
There it is. Yeah, it's.
Oh, yes, I thought that was a very interesting question, as are the questions about LiDAR and sharing information, which I think we should cover in Danny and the other person who said it. I think we should cover that in another webinar. I'm going to, oh, somebody else has just joined. Welcome back, everyone. How many people have got back?
Quick apologies to everyone in my group because we're chatting so much and suddenly got cut off. Sorry about that. We could have carried on talking for ages.
Yeah, the same happened in our group. We're just getting to the interesting bits.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I
Right,
know,
next time we'll leave longer breakout. We'll give you longer breakout rooms. Oh my goodness. A question about DNO and hydrogen. This is supposed to be a really simple tour of how to do a solar project.
Sorry about that, Liz. We're picking up on the DNO costs, the difficulties of getting the DNO connection, which we know is going to be difficult. And I'm thinking about the national parks, for example. If you start putting infrastructure in, we know it's difficult in the first instance, but if you have to put all the other plethora, connecting stuff. And I just wonder, is there a feasibility study you can point us to where we can do the generation, create the hydrogen, store it, because there will be industrial uses as we create the hydrogen economy. So I'm thinking laterally here.
That's a really good question. Well, I'll hand over to Martin to answer it. But before I do that, I will point out, I'll do a little plug. On the 12th of May, we've got a session about which will have the DNO for Hampshire speaking. So please come to that and put some of your questions to the DNO there. And they're keen to reach out to community energy groups as well. So do come and bring lots of people from Hampshire and actually also people from Surrey, because this particular DNO is SSE. Martin, do you want to report back and get each of our chairs to report back?
Yeah, I'm happy to do. I mean, quickly to go to Danny's point. Yeah, community energy needs necessarily to be low risk. So I think when we talk about storage and hydrogen, they're a little bit down the route. Lots of uncertainty, lots of risk. May not work for communities just yet, but we can have that. I'm happy to have that conversation offline with Danny as well, because the risk elements of storage and or risk profiles are much different from solar PV, and communities might not want to take that risk. Yeah, so quick feedback from our one. We did the farm. We were just starting to have that conversation about DNO, and actually SSE are very helpful. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to them. They will help. I mean, there's a limit to how much they can tell you, but they will help. They'll give you indications of what's there. But they're actually absolutely vital in the mix. You're not going to get anything developed unless there's a grid connection, and that can be a big issue. But going back just very quickly on ours, we looked at the farm. I think we decided it probably wouldn't work for various reasons. There may be some heritage risk there in terms of archaeology. There may be some flood risk. I think particularly we were worried about the local demand. There was probably none there because it was an animal barn and storage barn with very little load. The grid may not be particularly good there. So I think the overall conclusion was that one wouldn't work for us.
Okay, thank you. I'll hand over now to Nicola.
Hi everyone. We looked at a warehouse, an example warehouse in Basingstoke, which would have the capacity for 1 megawatt, a new roof with chillers inside, so high summer load and winter load. Possibility of a private wire to other buildings on the trading estate. And we thought trading estates often have one owner. They can often be large companies with net zero targets. We had 8 people in our group, really good discussion. We talked about the need to identify the load profile, half-hourly data and building efficiency information, ownership of the roof and lease length of the occupier, and relationship with neighbouring buildings, which would present possibility to private wire any excess generation, and can give you a backup if there was a PPA failure, if the tenant of the building was to drop away and didn't want to pick up the solar on the roof. Often in large buildings, we look at as community groups, sites that have multiple tenancies inside, which can be a fantastic opportunity, but then you've got multiple tenancies which might close that opportunity right down. So we talked briefly about the need for software that can share out that energy, looking at the total generation and then sharing it out to users on a fair basis. Understand that LiDAR are creating something called geo-variation, which might actually be owned by the Ordnance Survey. I need to pick up on that one. But supermarkets can be a good neighbour, and I think this site is a supermarket. And one last point was, we thought that councils should consider large organisations who want to come into an area and modify a building. Wouldn't it be great if the planning authorities could score them higher if they were to put community and renewables on that building or engage with community energy groups? That's us, thank you.
Great idea. I've just realised I should have asked Michael to report back first, because I know he's got another meeting to go to. So Michael, would you like to speak next?
Thanks, Liz. Yes. Okay. So we were talking on the schools. We were talking about the ownership arrangements, because basically in a secondary school is normally an academy. So you've got the academy school, you've got the local authority, which usually owns a building, and you've got obviously the community organisations. You need agreement between all of them, and also you're going to need permission from the Department of Education. So I would need to find the details of the link to include that later. But again, obviously, because the local authority often has multiple schools, it's possible to check to see if they've actually done anything before, in which case you can look at legal agreements and reusing them. There's a questions about the roof condition is obviously an issue. Public sector buildings are not necessarily known for being having massive investment in them, so it's looking at when actually what the state of the roof is. Often the schools nearly always have condition reports. They have a sort of a simple grading about the condition of the school, so that people will know that, and looking if there's actually plans for investment in the future. Obviously, one of the key things about a school is summer closure. So you're generally losing 6 weeks of supply, and so are there any ways to sort of mitigate that? Schools often actually have quite a high high load in the summer, but actually is a question about, can you actually help them to actually reduce that load by doing energy saving and linking with educational initiatives, and then looking at whether if there are potential to use that power elsewhere. But it may be simpler just to think about exporting it to the grid and making sure the model works on that basis. So there. And then there are questions about actually, again, just calculating the potential and looking at the sort of the possible output from the schools, and are there free tools that are available that can help calculate you to do that, to get an idea of what potential there is. So again, that was something to pick up on. I think that was our group.
Thank you, Michael. And finally, last but absolutely not least, Esme.
Thanks, Liz. So there were 6 of us, and we had a wastewater treatment works and a area of land that was 30 hectares next to it. So this is going to be a potentially large project, and the subject of a feasibility study. So we couldn't tell you whether it's going to work or not at this stage in 15 minutes. You'd need a little bit more time than that. So the kind of things we'd look at, start looking at who owns the wastewater treatment works. First of all, it may be owned by a regional water company, or probably will be owned by a regional water company, and do they want to have a solar array on that's powering their wastewater treatment works? First of all, do they have existing commitments? Do they have a framework that you need to go through? Do they have existing suppliers? So starting off there, and also looking at a bit of a desktop study. So look at the site on Google Earth, see what is surrounding it, see what aspect it is. Is it in any protected area? If it is, that's going to be a bit more difficult for planning. It had a very small woodland next to it. It's possible that could be protected. So if that's the case, could you improve the site for biodiversity as you're developing it, and start thinking about all of those aspects? It was agricultural land. So it's not favoured to develop highly productive agricultural land. So you can have a look at the Agricultural Land Classification Survey register and have a quick look to see if it's very productive agricultural land or not. If it is below, if it's 3B or lower on the Agricultural Land Classification Survey, it may be a good site to develop. If it's higher than that, it's going to be a bit difficult to develop it. We'd look at what's surrounding it. Is there any houses nearby? Are there likely to be any objections? Then we would start to look at their energy bills and look at the profile of the energy use and see if it has a decent energy use during the day. It looks fairly sizable. Hopefully it would have. The site itself is big, 30 hectares, so you could probably get up to 15 megawatts on there. So no limitation on space. But who owns that field? Is that actually owned by the water company, or is it owned by someone else? And will they develop the land for it? Lots of things you can look at. And then we looked at, can you look at biogas as well? So something else to consider. And then all the DNO application, get that in early and make sure that the DNO would approve that development as well. And going forward from that, you'd also want to look at any potential flood risks, no rivers nearby, so probably not. And then you can get into all the nitty gritty of it. So that's where we start.
Well, I'm so sorry you had to stop early.
That's okay. There's months of feasibility study there, isn't there, Martin? Where is that site, Martin, by the way?
That site, that's Basingstoke Water Sewage Treatment Works. Nice little site.
Yeah, it looks sizable. So I think it's a very promising project.
Yeah, that and the warehouse. I'd love to do those two. And the school.
Who owns the field?
Someone called the King's Fund.
Oh, so you know, okay. Right.
Yeah.
So
Right.
we've got 15 minutes left, and there are a couple of questions that probably need addressing. So Catherine from Harting can. Catherine, do you want to put forward your question about the DNO?
Yeah, people would. At what stage does the DNO seems to be quite a significant part? At what stage should you be bringing them on board? Do you notify them of an interest from the local community, or do you bring them on when you've done more of a feasibility? Yeah, just curious.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. They're fundamental to it. Without the DNO connection, you can't go anywhere. And it's like planning permission. It's one of those fundamental things that has to be done. It's once you've started to do the deep feasibility study, is when you need to start doing it. It's one of the first things to do because it's can be on the critical path. But you do need some experience in making the application. You need to have an outline design for the solar farm because you need to tell the DNO how big it's going to be and how much yield it will have. So you need to be quite a way down the route. And it's like all of these things. It's a bit like chicken and egg, which comes first. You need to get to that sort of, does the site work from a sort of the basis that we've already talked about? Is the land holder on side? That's when you need to start getting into that deeper analysis and then start talking to the DNO and start talking to the planners. So it's relatively early on, but not right at the beginning.
Thank you.
I'm just having a minor issue with my laptop, so I'm going to hand over to one of my colleagues to carry on hosting, please. I literally can't see anyone or anything. Oh, there they are.
Well, Liz, are you okay, or shall I just sort of wrap things up?
Keep managing it for a minute, please.
Okay, I'm just also conscious we are running a little bit over time and people need to get away. But yeah, I mean, was there other questions that were there? And Liz is obviously the past master at doing this. I'm happy to see if I can pick up some of the answers. How people are okay with time? Otherwise, we can begin to wrap things up.
Go till 11:30, Martin.
Are we? Oh, well, I've got loads of time. What am I talking? I thought
right, Liz?
Yeah, yep. Half
10 minutes of questions.
All right. I mean, in that case, I can relax. I was just worried that we were running over time.
Somebody asked a question about housing association roofs and agreements for how you share the power between the people who are living in the block of flats, say. Has anybody come up with a scheme for that?
I'd be very interested in answers to that one because it's one we've been looking at for a little while. And has anyone else actually done that? Because the issue is, how do you share the power across what is effectively a number of bill payers?
Exactly.
There has just been a RCEF award to a project investigating exactly this. I'm sure that they would be happy to share the results with you. I don't want to necessarily name them, but get a bombardment. So I could see if they would be willing to share results with you. They are in Hampshire. And this has been investigated a few times. Essentially, you would need to get your agreement with the co-op. So so you look at the ownership structure of the building. So are they actually owned by a co-op and then or a housing association? Because you would need to get the energy off-taker to take the PPA up with you. So if they can get a PPA with you and then look at how that is then recharged on, that's the kind of legal framework. But then it's the energy supply itself, that's a much more complicated. How is the how are the buildings wired up? It's essentially looking to retrofit a smart grid, really. So that's the complicated one. So I haven't got an answer to you on that.
It'd be interesting to have a reference to that study. The situation is likely to be that the roof is owned by, say, the local authority, maybe a housing association, and they would own the majority of the flats. But it's how the negotiation can go and how you can show costings which will benefit the residents at the end of the day. That is vital.
Yes.
Yeah, and the electrical system, you wouldn't want to have, if there's 12 flats, you wouldn't want to have 12 individual wires. You would need to wire it into one individual place and then supply from there. So it's how everything is all connected
Yes,
up.
the fabric is likely to be the major infrastructure is likely to be owned by the housing association or local authority. There will be individual flats that may be privately under right to buy purchased, but that's the overall ownership and maintenance is under the responsibility of the registered social provider.
I'm just going to hand over to Martine, who looks like she's new to all of this, and I really want to include new people and get them well ensconced in this world. So Martine, would you like to put your question to Martin and Esme in the panel?
All right, we have a new project affecting our parish, and it's also with a town. It's a two different district county, and we are having 9,000 houses built between the town and us. Our parish will have over 2,500 houses, and they are speaking of herbs. It's a garden community they are doing, and they are speaking of different kind of energy for different herbs. And I was wondering which one is the safest, which one will be the cheapest to run and produce the most. I try to understand everything, but I have so many feedback, like the hydrogen energy, it could explode, and it's a lot of damage around. We got not far from that project, quite a lot of buildings which are listed, grade 1 and 2. So we are quite worried. And I would like to know if I could have any advice, what is the safest kind of energy to have on our side? Sorry for the others.
That's all right. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating just to say that, Martina. We in Basingstoke, we and others are lobbying our local council. They're building 2,500 houses on a greenfield site, and we've been pushing very hard for them to make that. Well, actually, I was going to say carbon zero. We're actually trying to persuade them to make it carbon positive, i.e., sequesters carbon rather than actually produces carbon. And it's very difficult to get developers to buy into this, but it's I think the first place to start is how do you actually make sure that the construction of the new houses are energy efficient? So not just in terms of their energy use during their lifetime, but fundamentally most of the impact over the next 10 years will be the embodied carbon in the construction of the site. and actually getting developers to use carbon neutral or certainly carbon neutral construction techniques is absolutely critical to that. So it's really about, the very first thing is, how do we make sure these houses are designed to be as energy efficient as possible, both in terms of their construction and their operation. That's, I think, the very first thing to do. Difficult, because I know we're trying to do it with local developers at the moment. But then you need to think about the operational requirements of the development. Yeah, so how do we make sure that it doesn't have gas in there, and that it's all electric, it's highly efficient, and how do we make that electricity? Now, clearly getting solar panels on individual roofs is good, it can help, but fundamentally it needs to be effectively that development should be developed to something called a microgrid, where it actually has its own little grid, electricity grid, which had been fed by the solar panels on the roofs, but more importantly by other things in and around the site. It's possible to have a small wind farm near the site, for instance, feeding into the substation. It could have some ground-mounted solar PV. It could begin to think about what it's doing with its wastewater, whether that could be used in anaerobic digestion. So there's a whole host of things that need to be done. It's very complicated, but that's exactly where we need to be, is that we've got to get to the stage. It's a little bit off topic, that not one single building is built in the UK that isn't carbon neutral, but getting to that stage is going to be difficult. And there's a lot that can be done on new developments, and I'd love to be pushed to put the pressure on our local councils to say, if we're going to build 2,000 houses, or in your case 9,000 houses, how do we make sure they're carbon neutral, or even better, carbon positive, both operationally and from an embodied point of view? Long answer, but there's a lot that we can be doing on these sorts of things. And if that could be owned by the local community, or the energy infrastructure could be owned by the local community, even better.
Okay, we're coming to the end of the session. I was going to give one more question, but I've got colleagues whispering in the background, pushing me to go into my next meeting. So we're going to have to end it. There's been some fantastic questions that haven't been answered, so I'm very sorry about that. I will circulate all the questions, and perhaps we can find some answers from within our group. I also just want to urge you to keep in touch. I've been asked by Ollie for you to keep contacting us and letting us know of the projects that you're doing. You know, this is a really good forum for sharing groundbreaking and innovative projects, as well as for guiding people through the process, guiding newbies through the process of how to get the community energy project going. And my final point was, I would be really grateful for feedback. And if you could either email me with feedback about what worked or what didn't work for you about the session, or just put in the chat box what worked, what didn't, and also what you'd like to hear about us, what you would like to hear about next. I mean, for example, peer-to-peer selling sounds like, peer-to-peer trading sounds like something that would be of interest to those of us that have gone quite a long way down the community energy route already. But there might be, you know, people who are more new to this that feel another session like the one that Martin's just delivered today would be more helpful. So please do keep in touch and let us know what sort of things you'd like to hear about. I'll just put out to Esme, Nicola and Martin if there's anything you'd like to add.
No, for the moment, because otherwise you will run out of time. Next time.
Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, my email address is liz.sleeper@communityenergysouth.org, but you can always email Jessie and she'll forward it to me. Just put attention Liz and she can forward it all, because you should all have Jessie's email. I'll put it in here.
I came through Eventbrite, so sorry.
Right, good.
I think, yeah, if anyone wants to contact me, martin.heath@beds.co-op, and that's where I will be. Happy to answer questions, continue the discussion, because I think, like all of us on this call, we're all committed and passionate about community energy. And I'd like to see, my vision, I suppose, is that one day the entire energy system of the UK will be owned by the community or by cooperatives. Maybe not in my lifetime, but that's where I'd like to be, to see that the assets are owned by communities and cooperatives, and the installation is done by communities and then cooperatives, and the whole value chain is cooperative. But hey, you can dream.
Well, you don't get anywhere unless you have a dream.
Yep.
Oh yeah, I've put the slides up a couple of times already, but I can send them out, but I'll put them up on here one last time, and then you should be able to download them. You know, you can download everything from the chat box by clicking on the 3 little buttons above where you put your text. Let me just put this up. If you click on the 3 little buttons, you can download the chat box, and you should also be able to download that PDF of Martin's presentation.
And when you, Liz,
yes.
when it's Johnny here, hi. When you do send out the presentation as well as reposting the link, it'd be great if you put all those contact details that people are offering just in one place so that people can see them, because just writing them down quickly may be prone to mistakes.
They could get lost on little scraps of paper.
They could.
Yes, quite understand. Martin, it might be worth just popping your email in the chat box if you can.
All right, let's see if I can do that.
And then it'll be really annoying for anyone who's downloaded the chat box already. Okay.
Thanks all. I've got to go.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. Come again if you're from Hampshire or Surrey. Come again in 2 weeks' time. And well, actually, if you're interested in mapping, come as well in 2 weeks' time for the event on the 12th.
Right, thanks, guys.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Martin.
Bye, everyone. I'll mute myself. Nicola and Martin, thank you both so much, especially you, Martin. He's gone. Oh, no, he hasn't. Thank you so much for all the work you put in.
That's okay. Hopefully we will pick up some more community energy groups out of it all, which is the aim.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly hope so.
Okay. Well, look, anyway, we'll probably catch up, Liz. I need to get off because I've got my phone's ringing.
Yeah, me too. I've got a full-on day ahead, so catch up tomorrow.
Right. Well, thanks for organising it, Liz. That was brilliant. And Laura dropping out the last minute didn't seem to cause us an issue.
You did a sterling job there.
All right. Okay. See you later, guys. I've got to go.
Bye.
See you. Bye.
Everybody was good. Thank you very much.
Good. I'm glad, Martin.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining.
It's all right. I will email you. Thank you.
Okay.
Have a nice day.
Bye. And you. Bye. Au revoir.
Au revoir. Oh.